Okay, so let's take a look here at Flutter. Now, for those of you who don't know what Flutter is, Flutter is a system where you could go through and develop an app for the web, for desktop, for iOS, and for Google Play all in one place, right? So we'll talk about that as a particular tool, and then that can sort of like dovetail from your MVP and your low code and no code into native apps or progressive web apps. There are different options you have, so we'll talk about those on the flip side of this video.
Hi everyone. There are lots of reasons to think Google I/O is different this year, but one that's not: so many big things to talk about. Hi, I'm Fitz, developer advocate and chief educator for Flutter, and I'm here on your screens to talk through the Flutter and Dart highlights from I/O. Right up top, of course, is a new stable version. Flutter's moving forward, incrementing that version number to 2.2. That's great. I mean, it's got some nice symmetry to it, so I assume we'll stay here for a long time. But what does 2.2 really mean? Zoe said it best in the keynote.
In Flutter 2.2, we are focused on enhancing the quality and productivity of Flutter.
As a developer, even though Vim is my favorite editor, it doesn't give me feedback on my actual code as fast as I'd like. Yes, even with hot reload. And as an educator, anything that gives students clear indications of what's going on with the code is great. Asking the Dart analyzer and compiler to simply write all of my code for me might be too much to ask for, but the next best thing just might be sound null safety. Starting in 2.2, it'll be the default for all new projects. And as Bob says in his talk about why we added null safety, this can pretty dramatically shorten the cycle for finding some common errors and even improve your app's performance. The apps we build on The Boring Show might be boring, but what's more boring than a desktop finance app? But being boring isn't a bad thing, and Todd excitingly shows in his talk how to recreate an old app in Flutter with almost pixel-perfect perfection. And if you need to persist that finance data, Daco and Michael show in their talk how to use FFIGen to be able to call into the SQLite C library from Dart. Of course, desktop apps are more than utilitarianism like expense reports. There's a lot of really interesting things going on behind the scenes to improve stability of desktop support in Flutter. This includes making it easier to run apps on desktop during development and improving the tools, widgets, and support for writing platform adaptive apps. Speaking of tools, isn't it really frustrating when your app has so many animated Marty McFly widgets that it simply crashes or skips frames? When that happens, as it did with Justin in his talk, what do? Well, to the dev tools! The team has been doing a lot of work to build features and tools that make it easier to track down a wide variety of problems in Flutter and Dart apps. A really interesting one to me is the new custom memory timeline events. Importing the Dart developer package gives you access to a plethora of cool debugging, profiling, and tracing tools. Included in this, Post Event, which DevTools picks up and displays inline on the memory timeline, hopefully improving your productivity in looking for when that particular widget was built. Suppose I gave you a programming assignment. Make a successful Flutter app. Just getting it to successfully compile and without memory leaks is not a guarantee of receiving a good grade. But what does it mean to have a successful or high-quality app? For many people, that means having some kind of revenue source or allowing your customers to pay you. We've made improvements to the Google Mobile Ads SDK, like incorporating null safety and adding adaptive banners. Launched a new payments plugin that supports both Google Pay and Apple Pay, and moved the in-app purchase plugin from beta to production. A lot of people ask us the question, so who's actually using Flutter? Well, in the developer keynote, we talked about how over 30 teams within Google have chosen to build with Flutter. The Google Pay team is a great example. They unified around Flutter, which cut their code base in half, saving nearly 1 million lines of code. And Google isn't the only one to go through a similar journey. Countless developers around the world have created and deployed successful, high-quality Flutter apps. We've also continued to add and improve on your ability to use other Google APIs and services within Flutter and Dart apps. One example is Dart on Google Cloud Run. Kevin showed in the keynote and dives into it in his talk that containerizing a Dart app takes just a tiny amount of additional code and then gets you a relatively tiny binary to run your backend. And on the front end, we teamed up with Firebase to create, special for I/O, an open source Flutter web app powered by Firebase services. You can find it at photobooth.flutter.dev, along with the code and links to code labs for learning how to integrate Firebase into your own apps. Phew, that was a lot, but we're never done. All of these features, improvements, plugins, and other updates come around because of the feedback you give us and the GitHub issues that you file or upvote. I hope you enjoy this year's I/O, and as always, for more on this and all the other widgets, head on over to flutter.dev. Looking for people to be on your screen who aren't me? There are so many other great talks and sessions from I/O that you could be watching instead. Start with the links next to me or in the video description below.
Okay, so I know that seems like there was a dreaded thing about this. There was like code in there. Right? It seems really confusing, but what I can promise you is that you can do this. You can learn a little bit. But the fun thing about the code for both Google Assistant and Google I/O is that they're in plain English. So it's not anything where you will have to really do all this like crazy understanding of code. There's really very specific learning paths you can go on that are really quick, and you can just sort of understand the basics and be up and running really fast. So with Google Assistant, there are 3 basic things that are happening. There are what are called intents, which means like somebody plans to do something. There are shortcuts, like we're talking about voice shortcuts, and there's in-app promotion. Those are the 3 main categories. Nothing more complicated than that. And then from there, you can actually dive in and start to learn what each of the different pieces that are there. And there are samples, and there are what are called code labs. And code labs actually help you understand how to start from scratch and then begin to do that. So you can say, how do you take an Android app and add it to Google Assistant? And then the fun thing with both Assistant and Flutter is there are pathways. So this one is a pathway for Flutter. And it just tells you like, write your first Flutter app. And then we just literally get started and build the first Flutter app. And that's part of a code app. Building widgets, writing your first Flutter app part 2, and then intro to Dart, right? So we won't force you to code in App Camp, but the one thing we will do is just expose you to how easy it is to jump into it, so that as you work with developers or with other people, you can learn all kinds of fun things. And then everything that we're talking about today actually has a pathway with Google on the Google Developers Pathways, where you can basically learn all the different things. So you can just literally type in Assistant, right? Build actions for Google Assistant. And then voila, here are all the lessons to build actions for Google Assistant, and all the videos, right, are all right here. Very self-explanatory. We'll walk through some of that during the session. And then the same with Flutter, as we mentioned, right? So build apps with Flutter, build material design with Flutter. So when we talked about all those pretty new graphics that were available in Google Android, the next version, that's material design. So how do you begin to work with some of those color changes or some of the fancier things? Say you have a fun art app. Those are some of the things you would do with material design. So we can go through that as well. So all these things are, the point of talking about these things is that things are very doable, right? And so it's not that we use these terms, and as Asia and Christian talked about, we use all these different terms, but the reality is, it's all accessible. It's just literally putting it into the right sequence, right? So that's one of the things we do at Data 360 is just help you understand, one, about data being data driven, and two, how to access the information so that it's easy for you to break it down into doable chunks, and then be able to have a collaboration with your tech partners, whether it's Data 360 or many other developers that are out there.